Okay. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce all of you to Peter Geye. And Peter is the author of the award-winning novels Safe from the Sea, The Lighthouse Road, Wintering, and Northernmost. We just read his book, The Lighthouse Road, and Peter was born and raised in Minneapolis and has an MFA with the University of New Orleans, PhD with Western Michigan University, and currently teaches the year-long novel writing project at Minneapolis Loft Literary Center. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited to talk to you about this book and about your creative process and all things Peter Geye. And I know that our listeners are intrigued as well. So before we get started, I wanted to first start with a few icebreaker questions. I get nervous whenever I do these interviews. Icebreakers are pretty fun to literally break the ice, and how perfect considering we're talking about the Lighthouse Road in an area where there is lots of ice in winter. So the first question would be, what is the first novel that ever influenced you?
The first novel, first of all, thanks for cajoling me into doing this. It's fun to talk about a book that I wrote more than 10 years ago. And kind of you to invite me all together. The first book that influenced me, the first book that I was consciously influenced by, let's say that, was Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. And I was a junior in high school at the time, not a particularly good high school student, but I had a really terrific English teacher. He was playful. He was really smart. He encouraged us to laugh and goof off and have fun as much as he did to study. And I probably took that a little bit too far. And one day he asked me a question in class, and I didn't know the answer, so I gave some smart-ass response. And he really sort of scolded me and said, it's easier to be a smart aleck if you've read the book. Clearly, I had not done the assigned reading for that day. And so I went home that day, not actually home, but to my first job, where I sometimes read during my breaks or, did homework during my breaks. And I started reading the book, which was A Farewell to Arms. And right away, I was sort of captivated in the way that good books captivate you. My imagination was altogether invested, at least that's how I remember it. And by the time I got to the end of it, I thought, I want to do that. I want to write books like that. And so from the time I was, 16 years old or something like that, that's what I was in the business of trying to do.
That's wonderful. So you knew really early and just made a commitment that was going to be your plan.
Yep.
And was your teacher supportive in that? And
yeah, I mean, he did his name was David Benkin. I went to Minneapolis South High School. He and I are still friends. He's still around, and he was encouraging. Not necessarily about becoming a writer, although he probably thought that was cool, but he really helped me to become a better reader. And not only through the books that we read in class, but through what he would talk to me about separately. I became genuinely curious. And so he was helpful in, turning me on to what came next. And after I read Hemingway, he told me about Willa Cather and Eudora Welty and F. Scott Fitzgerald and other writers, that 30, however many years ago, were the main part of the American canon. And so, yes, he did encourage that. He also, and this was an enormous boost to a part of my life that I didn't have much confidence in. That was my junior year when I read Hemingway for the first time. And when it was time to register for classes for my senior year, he told me that I should sign up for advanced placement English. And it was the first time that any sort of academic significance had happened to me. And I was just floored by that. I thought only the smart kids are in advanced placement classes. Certainly this is a mistake, but he said no, he thought that it would be terrific for me. And so I was in advanced placement English my senior year, which was really, I think, a big boost to my confidence and really helped to, in another way encouraged me in the reading life.
That's outstanding.
Yeah.
Next icebreaker question. What was your first job ever?
Yeah. Well, there are sort of two answers to this. When I was really young, like probably 12 years old, I worked at a little restaurant at the Minnesota State Fair. For those folks down your way who don't know about the Minnesota State Fair, it's an enormous thing up here in Minnesota. One of the highlights of everybody's year. I forget what it is. Something like 2 million people go through the fair each year. It's 10 days right before and over Labor Day, ends on Labor Day, which is neither here nor there. But I had a job working for family friends who ran a restaurant there. And I did that for a couple years. And then later, that same family gave me a job in a pizzeria that they owned. And that is, in fact, where I went with a farewell to arms, and on my break sat down and had my, whatever it was, my piece of pizza for dinner, and started reading that book. So there's some confluence there.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Third question. Where would you travel if money and time were no object?
Oh, I mean, I think that there has to be a third qualifier here, because if it were just me, I would go back to Norway. But because our last big trip before the pandemic was to Norway, I think my wife would insist on someplace warm and sunny and beachy. So if I know that it has to be someplace warm and sunny and beachy, I would probably choose, I don't even know. I might choose, not because it's an exotic location, but I might choose Southern California, because then I could visit with my sisters who all live down there.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah.
I love that. What's the most daring thing you've ever done?
Well, the most obvious answer is that I was a ski jumper growing up. And ski jumping, like in the Olympics now, that's the only time anyone in America ever knows about it, but where you go for distance, not where you're doing flips and acrobatics. That's aerial and
You soar
freestyle
through the
skiing.
air.
Yep. But and it's still something that I'm involved in, not myself, but two of my kids participate. They're just sort of getting started. And my brother, who's my best friend as well, really helps run the program here in Minneapolis. Not that there's much of one, but we do our best. And so it's still a part of my life and doesn't feel like it was daredevilish at all. But if someone were to take a look at my resume, at all the things I've done, no doubt that's what any observer would say.
How high would you jump when you did that?
Well, it's not a question of how high you jump as
Okay.
much as it is how far you jump.
Okay.
And so in the Olympics, there are two sized hills. There's what they now call a normal hill, and they call the other is the large hill. And those size jumps are the biggest jumps that I ever went off. And it's a different sport now than, again, this is another thing that I did 30 years ago, much different sport now than it was then. But my longest jumps were like, 325 or 350 feet, something like that.
Yeah. And your kids are following that as well and learning.
Well, yeah, they're just getting started. So the oldest son who does it had his longest jump of his life the other night, and he went about 60 feet or so. So he's got a little ways to go to catch up, but if he sticks with it, he surely will. It would not be hard to be a better ski jumper than I was.
Now, as a parent watching, what's the experience? Are you calm?
I'm mostly calm. Yeah, I mean, one of the differerences in the sport between now and then is that it's much safer now. The hills are contoured in a way that are much safer. There's all sorts of safety apparatus. They're groomed much better than when I was a kid. And so though people sometimes still get hurt, as you would in any, sort of physical endeavor, the occurrence of like serious injury is pretty rare. And though, when they make steps up, when they go to the next jump up, it's always a little nerve wracking. I'm never really worried that, they're going to crash and break a leg or something. So not too much. It's mostly excitement. I'm mostly just like a boy out there again, which is something I haven't been for a while. I'm a pretty old man.
Okay, last icebreaker question: paper or pen when writing, or a computer?
I mean, it depends an awful lot. I carry a pen around with me. I mean, I'm holding one. I just have one in my hands at all time, or in my shirt pocket or whatever. And I carry notebooks around. My little pocket notebook is right here, and so I'm constantly jotting notes down. And oftentimes, depending on the day and other variables that I can't even account for, I'll sit down and begin writing by hand. But mostly, I think I probably would say I compose on the computer. Um, I think that's true now. It didn't used to be. When I was writing Lighthouse Road, for example, this whole book is written out in hand first in some box of papers down in the basement.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, switching to Lighthouse Road, I wanted to first ask you what inspired the story.
Oh, well, I mean, there are probably more answers to that question than I know the answer to, but there are a couple of things that were really um, significant at the outset. One of them is that so the book that I wrote that I wrote and published first is a book called Saved from the Sea. You mentioned that when you introduced me, and that book took like 10 years to write. Not 10 years of sitting down every day, but 10 years, so many drafts. I was learning so much as I went along. I went through both of my graduate school programs as I was learning to write that book and as I was writing that book. And so it was just a really long process. And eventually, I found an agent and a publisher, a small literary press for it, and it was coming out in the world. And at about the time that all of that was happening, I was just getting started on the Lighthouse Road. And the Lighthouse Road started out as a very simple story. It was just going to be Thea's story, the story of a young woman coming from Norway and what was going to happen to her once she got here. And I started writing it that way with a really sort of thorough outline, pretty clear plan in mind, because I didn't want to take 10 more years to write a book. It was too much fun to be a published author. But as soon as I did start writing it, and you mentioned just a second ago, do I write by hand or by on the computer? And I remember writing the first chapter in my notebook and getting to the end of it. And at the end of the first chapter, and in the Lighthouse Road, Thea gives birth to her son. And as soon as that kid was on the page, I was like, well, I have to tell his story too. And I started sort of extrapolating the lives of this family. And it ended up that, before I was a month into the project, I had like 7 generations of a family instead of one young woman. So that young woman was the original inspiration. And I don't know where she came. I mean, I know part of where she came from. And I have a picture of an image in the book somewhere in my office here of this woman standing outside of a lumber camp, and why she appealed to me, I can't exactly say, but I'd spent a lot of time pausing on that photograph for whatever reason. And I just thought I'll tell her story. I'll make up a story about her. And so it's weird. It's weird to think about something that happened so long ago and have like there's that specific beginning point, but that's like the first day of being inspired by this story. And there were a couple of years of being inspired to write this story, and as there is any story. And so it's hard to uh, conjure up all of the different moments when the story kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But that image of that young woman was the start of it for sure.
Interesting. And it carried on through other books as the story continued to be told
Yeah.
of the family.
Yeah. Yep.
Wonderful. Why did you choose to rotate between the era of the 1800s and the 1920s when writing? Was that a specific choice?
Yeah, well, this goes back to that dilemma, and it was a dilemma. It was not a small one either. I had mapped out pretty much all of Thea's story, which was her arrival in Gunflint, her working for the lumber camp, what happens to her at the lumber camp, what happens to her after childbirth and all of that. That was the story. I thought I was going to write a 200-page novel about that. But I mentioned, as soon as Ode is born, I had this feeling like, well, I have to tell his story too. And as soon as I had that realization and was sure that it was a good instinct and not, I'm still not even sure it was a good instinct, but I have to assume that it was, because it's led me to where I ended up with these 3 books, the 3 books being the Ide family books. But I had a choice. I could either just hold on to his story and tell it as a second book, or but that all of a sudden seemed daunting by the fact that there were then 7 generations of this family all of a sudden. So that sounded like a 1,000-page book in 10 more years, which was not what I had in mind. And so I had to figure out how to tell the stories together. And I'm really glad that I made the choice that I did, because I learned an awful lot from writing The Lighthouse Road, a lot that has informed the other books that I've written since, and continues to inspire the books that I'm writing now, which is, I don't think stories happen one character at a time or one point of view at a time. And certainly they don't happen in a linear fashion. At least in my experience in life and on the page, the way that these stories occur to me, the way that they develop in my mind, it's never, 2 things have never happened in a row or consecutively, right? Like nothing ever goes from one moment to the next. There's always from one moment back 50 years or ahead 50 years, or an hour or back an hour. And so that the way that the stories tell themselves to me, there's no other way to tell them to readers. And certainly, if I didn't know what I was doing at the outset with The Lighthouse Road, of going back and forth with their stories, and I really did write them with only a few exceptions. Like I would write a chapter for Thea, and then I would write a chapter for Ode. I would write a chapter for Thea, then I would write a chapter for Ode. And so that going back and forth was not only part of what was happening in my head, in my imagination, but it's part of what was happening in practice as I was writing the story, going back and forth. And so it was very deliberate. I mean, I was not always clear about how I was going to make the connections between the 2 timelines. I mean, besides the obvious blood connections, but it was obvious that this is how the story was going to be told.
And then what about the characters Hosea and Rebecca? What inspired them? Did you know anybody like with those personality types, or were they an amalgam of?
I mean, I don't base characters. I never have, with only very rare and usually very minor exceptions, on people that I know. As the world of this novel started filling out, and as I started to imagine the world beyond Thea and beyond Ode, who the people were in their lives that weren't each other, obviously I needed to come up with a cast, right? I needed to come up with who these people might be and what they might look like and what they might do. And one of the things that I was after, one of the things that I was really interested in writing about, was the nature of family and how ambiguous it can be and how different it can be for different people. And I think that, which is to say, in The Lighthouse Road, as people who have read the book know, Hosea acts as a sort of father figure to Ode, even though he's not. He purports to be Rebecca's father, even though he is not. Rebecca, plays her role as Hosea's daughter, but also later as Ode's much older lover, and in fact, the mother of his child, and of their child together, I should say. And so it becomes a very complicated, a sort of messy stew of who's who. And in that stew, I want people who are interesting and people who don't fit molds, who will surprise me as much as they'll surprise the reader. And that's sort of how I got there with Rebecca and Hosea. One of the things that I do as a practice when I'm writing a book is, whenever I come along come upon, I should say, a character who I know is going to stick and who I know is going to be a significant character in the story, I start imagining a biography for them. So I'll put things down like it begins with very simple things like their name and their connection to the other characters in the story, where they're from, what they look like, what their job is, that sort of thing. And sometimes those biographies will be like pages and pages in a notebook. And sometimes they're much shorter, but any sort of anything goes. It's a sort of resource for me, a place that I can go back to when I need to be reminded of something about the characters. And there's a moment in the Lighthouse Road when Hosea is telling someone, I forget who, that he studied at the Sorbonne as a
Mhm.
as a medical student.
I remember that.
And I got to that moment and I was like, I went to my notebook in the biography and I wrote studied at the Sorbonne, and I looked at it for a second and put a question mark next to it. And in all of the characters that I've ever written, characters of, at least his significance, I've never left a question unanswered there, but I did with him. I didn't want to know yet whether he actually studied at the Sorbonne, what his past actually looked like. I wanted it to be mysterious to me so that I wouldn't feel like I was holding back from the reader or that I had some inside scoop that they didn't have. And to this day, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I have a pretty good idea because Hosea is actually in the book that I'm working on now. But I didn't know then. And that kind of ambiguity that is so much a part of him was the main thing that attracted me to him. I mean, I think he is the number of conversations that I've had about whether or not he's a good man, and the number of it's like a 50-50 split, and which is exactly what I desired for him. I wanted him to be ambiguous morally, and I wanted his past to have some ambiguity. I wanted his relationship with Rebecca to be ambiguous. I wanted his relationship with Ode in sort of both phases of Ode's life, when he's growing up and when he makes the break, for there to be ambiguity there, because I think that that ambiguity is a big part of life. I don't know very many people who are um, good or bad, right?
Mhm.
There's usually some grayness in folks.
And that certainly kept me wondering throughout the book, are we going to find out, is he a con artist? Is he not? Is he truly a caring father figure, or is he manipulative? That gave some intrigue
Yeah,
throughout the novel. I kept wondering.
and those are questions that I asked myself a lot as I was writing his story. On the one hand, I mean, I think, and I think about these books now, not really as much as the author, although of course I'm aware of that, but I think about them um, as a reader might. And
Hmm.
so the same questions that you're asking are questions that I asked and I grapple with still. I mean, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that there's no reason to stop learning from your characters, just like there's no reason to stop learning from characters in any books that you read. And whether he's a good, decent man or a total, you know, uh, con artist, like you say, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that he raised Ode as if he were a son, treated him like a son, probably um, took advantage of Ode in ways, certainly was kind and decent to Thea, um, helped take care of her, helped her land on her feet when there was no one else there to do it. Why he did those things or what he actually thought, I still don't know. And I'm not sure I'll ever find out, but I'm okay with that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the scene and why you chose the town that you did, and what might have inspired that environment, that unique environment.
Yeah, I mean, so the town of Gunflint, which is where so much of this novel takes place, is a fictional town based on a real place. Not exactly a real place. There's the whole North Shore of Lake Superior, Minnesota, is a really important place to me. And I made a choice when I was writing. Actually, when I was beginning to write um, the Lighthouse Road. I had just finished Safe from the Sea, and it was in the process of selling it. And I decided that I was going to fictionalize this stretch of land. It's basically about 150 miles from Duluth, Minnesota to the Canadian border, all along the shore of Lake Superior. And it's in a place that's really important in my life. I mean, I've been going there since I was a little boy. It's the gateway to the Boundary Waters canoe area, place I spent a lot of time growing up, and still like to get back to as much as I can. And just these little towns where we spent a lot of time as a child. There's state parks, there's the Superior National Forest is a big part of that landscape. And so I really have been intimate with it from a young age. And I wanted to bring that place to life. I wanted to bring the North Shore to life. But I realized almost as soon as I started writing about it in Safe from the Sea, that I was going to have to make places up to suit my fictional purposes. And one of the things that I realized is that Gunflint is one of the only real towns on the North Shore. And it's based on Marais, Minnesota, which is one of the only real sort of proper towns. I think the only stoplight, well, there are two stoplights on the North Shore. One of them is in Marais, and one of them is in Silver Bay, Minnesota. But it's that kind of place. There's just nothing there except for wilderness and resorts and that sort of thing. And I just wanted to bring it to life. I mean, I think it's a beautiful place. It has so much on offer. In real life, it has a ton on offer. There's a million reasons to go there. But as a writer of fiction, especially, there's so much happens as a consequence just of being there. There's the seasons, which are larger there. There's the lake itself, which is enormous and impossible to describe. There's the wilderness that, as soon as you step out of the water and onto the shore, with very few exceptions, you're in wilderness for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And there's all sorts of intrigue and danger in that. And that's just like cherry picking for a fiction writer. It does so much of the work for you. And I really wanted to sort of, bring this part of the world, I guess I should say, in my vainer, more ambitious phases of thinking about this, I wanted people from other parts of the world to see it.
Yeah.
To have the experience, because not that many people do. In Minnesota, everyone goes up to the North Shore, and it becomes more and more each year a tourist destination, and you see license plates from all over the country. But it's not like Yellowstone or something, though I think it's just as beautiful.
And especially right now, it's nice, and I'm glad that you brought up the Boundary Waters, because it's so important for people to know about this area and some of the threats to this beautiful part of the world.
Yeah.
And the great work that's being done on its behalf.
Well, and it's as it's always been, a sort of never-ending battle between, and I think kind of, well, I probably won't say that, but I think a battle that doesn't necessarily need to be fought in the way that it's fought. There's a lot of mining that happens in northern Minnesota. The Iron Range, which is a famous part of our national economy, is what for generations has kept that part of our state afloat. And it's why, in fact, there's as much settlement along the North Shore as there is, because the iron ore was mined on the range and brought to the shore of Lake Superior, and then shipped down to the industrial breadbasket of America. And we've been able, for the most part, to do that, to mine the ore and ship the ore, while maintaining the Boundary Waters and Lake Superior as the sort of pristine wildernesses and natural places that they are. I mean, of course, there are exceptions to this, and of course, there have been periods of less stewardship of the land and of the lake, but generally that's true. And what's happening now is that there are people in interest trying to go ever closer to the actual Boundary Waters. And for those folks who don't know, the Boundary Waters is I forget how many millions of acres it is and how many thousands of lakes it is, but it's all parkland. and it's all a national wilderness area that you can go into only in a canoe. There's no roads, there are no cabins, there's no anything except for designated campsites on each of these lakes. And you can go in and spend, I mean, I don't even know what the numbers are. There are literally thousands of lakes and rivers in this area that are totally pristine. You can drink the water right out of the lake, even still. I mean, it's better to filter it, but if you're in a
Mhm.
big enough lake, it's like that. And of course, it's endangered because
Yeah.
of the financial interests of mostly foreign companies, and you know that old saw about, do we want to preserve the land or do we want jobs, because we can't have both. That seems to be the argument. I don't think that's the case.
How much time do you spend now in Grand Marais, and have you had many discussions with people from the community around your books?
Yeah, well, I spend as much time as I possibly can up on the North Shore. It's still my go-to spot. My kids love it, and my wife loves it, and it's a big part of our life still. Not so much lately, of course, with the pandemic, but I mean, I think that in normal times, I'm probably on the North Shore for one reason or another between 6 and 10 times a year. um, Last year we vacationed up there. We went camping for a week near Split Rock Lighthouse, and so it's like we go skiing up there. We spend time up in Grand Marais. We just go up as often as we can, and certainly I've talked to people up there. I've done a lot of events in Grand Marais. I've done a lot of events all up and down the shore, and in the libraries in the small towns that dot the shore. Um, and I think that I've never really gotten an impression one way or another about how the folks who actually live there think. I think that the days of families having sort of homesteaded there and several generations having lived there, there aren't a ton of those people anymore. There are some, but there aren't that many people all together. I mean, Cook County, which is the real life county that Arrowhead County is based on, is twice the size of Rhode Island, and I think it has 6,000 people living in it. So there's not a lot of people to talk with about the book, and people generally aren't sort of aren't the chatty sorts, people who live up there. They mostly just want to be left alone. But I mean, I think that people have told me that they appreciate it, that they think it's a good representation of the place. Of course, there are mistakes that I've made not being a native of that part of the state, only having been a visitor. Mistakes that I've made, with respect to animals and their migratory patterns and things like that. But but generally, yeah, I think that people are happy to have someone writing about that part of the world.
Well, having been there myself quite a few times, I think we probably go up there at least 3 times a year. It was really fun to read this story and feel that region come to life. And there were moments where I thought, well, I've been here in the middle of winter. I've been up the Gunflint Trail, and there was a moment where they're in the book where one of the characters was delivering the large Ovcharka
Hmm.
dogs, and he was using the ice to move. And I stopped the reading for a moment to talk to the listeners about how up in the boundary waters there's this moment where you can use the ice like a highway, and then when it warms up you can't. So that was the only moment where I thought, how would this be different if you hadn't been there? And I did stop and explain that for a moment, and then we carried on.
Yeah,
But that brings me to one of my other questions, which was about the I don't know if I'm even saying it
you
correct,
are. Yep.
the Ovcharka dog, which I had
Yeah.
never heard of. And I immediately, when we finished that day, I started searching to learn about this dog and instantly became terrified because they are gigantic. Tell me more about why you chose that dog and any history you have with that.
Yeah. So
What the
I
dog
don't.
is.
So the Ovcharka dog is a dog. It's a very uncommon breed. I honestly don't recall whether it's like um, acknowledged by the American Kennel Club, or if it's a you know, if it's just not. But I was looking for, what I was looking for was the largest, most fearsome dog that I could find, and it was I don't remember where I came across from it, either in a book of dog breeds, which I have around here somewhere, or just poking around online. I mean, I wonder, that would have been, I guess there was internet back then, to the point where you could Google things, although it's close to being longer ago than that. But
Sure.
I just wanted, I wanted that huge dog to be a part of the story. It's something that I haven't recognized until recently, but every book that I've ever written has a dog in it, kind of a significant
Oh,
dog in it. And it's not intentional. I love dogs. I have a dog. She's sleeping somewhere. But it's not intentional that there happens to be dogs in all these stories. In this story, I wanted it for a couple of reasons. I wanted Thea at the camp to have a sort of companion, because she wouldn't have had a companion otherwise, and these dogs become her companions, and they are a part of the sort of climactic, or one of the climactic scenes in the story. And I knew that the story was building to this, and I just wanted there to be that dog, and so I figured out what dogs would fit that category. And I didn't want it to be, a dog that everyone would recognize. I wanted it to be something off the beaten path, which certainly an Ovcharka is. I've never seen one, except for images online. I don't know anyone who has one. But I just want it's the the two Ovcharkas that come back to the lumber camp are, they're the nemesis of the wolves that are haunting the place, and so there's this sort of natural showdown between them. What was just as interesting to me, and I'm glad that you brought up the dog sled, where the young boy goes to fetch the dogs. Um, that that family is based on a real life family in northern Minnesota lore, a quite famous one, the Bear Grease family, and that is how people in the wintertime, at this time, at the turn of the last century, until there was a highway many years later, people got around going on dog sled in winter, or on boats in summertime up and down the shore of Lake Superior. And I've been fascinated by that. Years ago, I read a biography of the Bear Grease family, and I was just delighted by it. And I thought, I want to bring that into this, partly to demonstrate the remoteness of where we were in the setting of this book, but also to bring that little bit of real life to the story. And there are a couple of places, I'd be hard pressed to think of others, where real life intrudes on the story like that, in a fictionalized way. But that was definitely a deliberate choice.
well, and that scene, that climactic scene, was fantastically suspenseful and spooky. And as the person reading it live, I started to get scared, but I had to keep my composure. But you did a brilliant job of building the
Thank
suspense.
you. That scene is it was the first scene like that I'd ever written, which is to say, a scene where sort of all the elements of the story come together in a scene of pretty vivid action and serious peril for some of the characters, people and dogs alike, to say nothing of the horses. And I did a ton of research about the logging camps, and how that might have worked, and and was daunted by it, was really daunted by the prospect of writing that story. But as soon as that part of the story, as soon as I finished it, though, it was the first moment in the writing of this book where I thought, okay, I figured that out. I think it's a pretty good scene, and I can go ahead and finish the book now.
And as we carried past that scene, Thea began to use her Bible to speak and engage when being interviewed. And I was curious about that choice of her using that.
Yeah, so I mentioned at the outset when we were first talking about the way that from Thea, the sort of the rest of this family, including Thea's parents, came to mind. And Thea's parents are actually characters who I write about in my most recent book, a book called Northernmost. They're half of that story. So as long ago as when I was writing The Lighthouse Road, I was thinking about who her parents were and who she left behind when she came to America and who she was expecting to find when she got here. And a big part of the of how I imagined them was as religious people. Is there were a lot of religious people who came to this part of the country, who came to Minnesota from Scandinavia. I mean, they're a pretty devout group. And so of course that would have been a part of where she came from and how she identified with the world. But there was another thing that was true about Thea, and that is that she didn't know the language. She knew very few words in English. And so she could only communicate what had happened to her during this sort of interview or interrogation by the magistrate through her Bible. She didn't know how to articulate the trauma of what had happened to her. So she chose passages from the Bible that she knew. And I don't exactly remember where that idea came to me from, except that in my memory, Thea was very often with her Bible. Like when I imagined her, getting ready for bed and
Like a source of
or
comfort.
yeah, yep, in the way that it is for so many people. And it was just there. It was like an appendage or something practically. And I remember thinking, well, what if she did that? What if her way of trying to describe the horror that she went through, if she did that through her Bible? And what would the ambiguity of that look like if you were on the receiving end of that, of that sort of what's the word where you um, in legalese, if you
Oh,
were
a
on the receiving
deposition.
deposition, exactly.
Mhm.
How would you comprehend it? How would you make sense of what this young woman was trying to tell you? And that added to the layers of ambiguity and sort of the lack of specificity, which is another big part of what I wanted to do with this book.
Well, thank you so much for writing it. I know it's been a while since you did. I'm really looking forward to reading your other books and hearing more of the story of the family. My partner introduced me to your work, and I'm really intrigued to carry on and read the others. I hear that there are bears
There are
in
bears.
a few of them.
Yes. Yeah, bears are like dogs. They're not in every one of them, but they are around. That's for sure. Yeah, especially
What
with this family.
what's next on the horizon? What are you working on right now?
I mean, I have a lot of irons in the fire, as they say. I'm working on a new book that sort of, it's not the same family, although characters from the family appear, but is set back in the same time as the Lighthouse Road, specifically in the first decade of the 20th century. And so a lot of the characters in the Lighthouse Road make either significant appearances like Hosea or cameo appearances in smaller ways. And it's a ton of fun to be writing that. I also just finished another book that I'm trying to figure out what is going to happen with. And it's an interesting time to be a literary novelist in America. And so we'll see what happens with that one.
There was one other, actually, I had two other questions for you. One was about the cover and how the choice of the cover was made.
Yeah, so it's actually, there's an interesting story that comes with that. On this sort of this horizon line.
Yeah.
So this scene, when they first showed it to me, I looked at it and I was like, oh gosh, that's just great. That just looks terrific. That so looks like where I imagined Ode would live.
Yeah.
And then I was like, hold on a minute. In the background on the horizon, there were all these towering mountains. which is of course not the case in northern Minnesota. It's hilly, but there aren't mountains. And
Yes.
so I brought that to the attention of my editor, and I was like, can we not edit these mountains out? And so they did. But it's and that's the anecdote about it. They did edit it out, and I do love the image, even though it's not a Minnesota image. And
It looks like a lake up in the Boundary Waters.
yeah, it
You
does.
walk across.
Yep, it
Very nice.
does. That the boat that's in the
Mhm.
the boat here is not a Lake
Mhm.
Superior boat, and if you're an aficionado of any sort, you would know that. Fortunately, there aren't very many of those. The thing that's true about book covers is that unless you're Louise Erdrich or someone of that ilk, you don't have a lot of say in it. Publishers have, they have their own ideas about what cover is going to sell a book. And I don't know, I've just never been the sort to put up a fuss. I suppose maybe if I could get things changed. Not that I've ever wanted to. I've loved the covers of my books for the most part. But it's sort of out of our control as authors.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, my last question had to do with, and I didn't mention this when we were preparing, but about movies. Have you ever considered or wanted or been in discussion about any of your books becoming a film?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I would love that. I mean, not necessarily because I want the books to be made into movies. They're two very different art forms, but because of because of the money that it would mean.
Sure.
Um, the only time I've ever sort of gotten close with that was with my first book. It was optioned. It was actually optioned the same week that I sold the Lighthouse Road. So that would have been sometime in like 2009. And what an option means is that a production company gets a hold of it and they have the rights to develop it. They pay you well, they paid me anyway, a small sum of money, and that gives them the right to keep doing it. And they had the rights to Say from the Sea for something like, I mean, a pretty long time, maybe 8 years or something, but and got close, I think, to making it a couple of times.
Mhm.
There was a screenplay written for it. There were, there were different talks about who was going to be cast in the film, but it just never happened, which is too bad. But it's also, I don't know, 10 years ago when I was first publishing books, it sounded like the greatest thing in the world. And now that have published 4 books and working on these others, I just don't think about that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. It would be great. Of course, it would be great. It would be lovely if someone came along and said, here's $1 million to make this into a movie, and it would help sell books. But it's just not part of what I do. I mean, what I do happens at 5 o'clock in the morning in this desk chair on my own with my pens and my notebooks and my, and my imagination. And it's not the most exciting life, except that it thrills me.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And now with your teaching at the Loft Literary Center, are you working with people that are developing themselves as writers?
Yeah, so the program that I teach there and help develop there is a year-long course for folks who want to write a novel. And some of the people who enter the program have actually written a novel and are looking to revise it or make it better. Others just have an idea, and we spend a year together. This year I have 18 students, which is a huge number of students in 2 different groups. And it's sort of like being in an MFA program, except you don't have to do any of the academic coursework. Super intensive. We do a lot of writing, a lot of reading. And at the end of it, the object is that they come out of it on the other end with a finished manuscript, one that they're, if not ready to, headed in the direction of being ready to take out to agents and hopefully get published.
Oh, that's interesting. That's
Yeah.
outstanding.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share before
Oh,
we
nothing that
sign
I
off?
can think of. No. Thanks so much for having me. It was just a lovely
Yeah.
conversation. It's so fun to revisit this book that it's been on my mind a little bit more lately because of the other book that I'm writing, but it's a long time ago that I wrote this book, and And these characters, though they never go away, as I was paging through it, getting reacquainted with them, it was a ton of fun. So thanks for
And
that.
there's so much detail that I could see why it would be challenging to
Yeah.
keep up with all that
Yep.
detail. Over
Yeah,
time.
especially the older I get, the more forgetful I become. I guess that's how it goes. Yeah.
It happens to all of us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'll
Yeah,
go
thanks,
ahead and
Anna.
pause the recording.